Hi everyone, welcome to a exam walkthrough for a crime and punishment paper with the OCR exam board. This paper is usually paired with another one, or should be paired with another one, which for us at Norton College is Norman Conquest. This means the crime and punishment paper is 40 marks and the Norman Conquest paper is 40 marks, and they will be together when you go in the exam hall for a total of 80 marks. This video here is designed to give you some pointers on the question types that you'll come across in the crime and punishment paper, and give you some sort of basic guidelines that'll help you with the crime and punishment questions. And what I want you to do when coming away from this video is to ideally think, you know what, those crime and punishment questions aren't actually that difficult to write. They're pretty straightforward once you know the fundamentals with them. Now you start the crime and punishment paper with 3 1-mark questions. And I like to call these questions the warm-up questions, because the idea is just to get your recall going at the start of the mock or full exam, and the answers for these can actually oftentimes be used in questions later on down the line. Sometimes, say for example, if you look at that 1A, identify one way in which a suspect could avoid trial in the period 1250 to 1500, the medieval period. If you get a question about punishment in that time period, you can use the answer to 1A in that question. Likewise, 1B, give one example of the change in nature of crime in the period 1500 to 1750. If you get a question, an 18-marker, that's asking you to delve into crime in the early modern period, you can use the answer that you put for 1B in your 18-marker. So these are designed not only to get you going for the exam, but can also give you a couple of good ideas to use later on. Now, the main guidance here on the 1-marker is try not to be too blithe, try not to be too short or abrupt, but at the same time, don't belabor the point, don't write sentences and sentences and sentences. You shouldn't really have to go past the line. But the reason why I'm saying don't be blithe, don't be abrupt, is because the examiner is actually asked not to give you the mark if you're too short, if you're too abrupt. So for an example, one that I've seen in exemplars is a question that says, identify one way in which crime developed in the modern period, or identify one reason why crime developed in the modern period. Yeah, that's that one. And a lot of people put in the answers technology. Now, yes, that is correct, but the examiner is specifically asked for you to be more specific on that. So just to show you what I mean by that, here it says for 1B, the question being, give one example of the change in nature of crime in the period 1500 to 1750. One of the examples it gives is increase in organised crime such as highway robbery and smuggling. So, sorry, that line's all over the place, but you can still read it, hopefully. So, if you were to say organised crime, you wouldn't get the mark. If you were to just say highwaymen or smuggling, you wouldn't get the mark. But if you say organised crime like highwaymen, if you say smuggling, which was an organised crime, you're far more likely to get the mark. And that means that earlier on you heard me say that question, identify one reason why crime developed in the modern period. Technology, that's why that doesn't get the mark. But if you were to say technology like the car, technology like the computer, you're far more likely to get the mark than if you just say technology. So try and think about it a little bit more. Try and make some sort of connection there in the 1-marker. So the next question that the exam will present you with after the 3 1-markers is the 9-mark question. Now, you know in class that we've been seeing the 9 and the 10-marker, and to an extent the 18-marker, the way you build them, are not actually that different. You create your paragraphs and you structure them in very similar ways. You have your line of argument, which is what you think. You support it with specific detail, and you explain it with a second order concept, and you link back to the question. So just to model the process here, straight off the top of my head, what do I actually think about that question? Write a clear and organised summary that analyses crime in Britain since 1900. Okay, what is a new crime? What is a developing crime in this time period? Well, terrorism has changed substantially in the modern time period. Now I'm going to support that using specific detail. We're talking about the IRA. We're talking about Islamic terrorism, particularly in the 21st century. How we explain that was second order concept. Well, terrorism changed in the modern period as terrorists began to be able to access more technology or different technology, meaning that it was far easier to bomb targets, it was far easier to access guns and bomb making technology. As well as this, the causes of terrorism changed. We talk about that Islamic terrorism in the 21st century. Britain was involved in a lot of wars in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan, which meant some extremist Islamic groups began to target the UK. And you saw that with incidents like the Manchester Arena bombing a few years ago. Then you'd link back to the question and say, therefore, one of the main reasons crime has changed in the time period 1900 to the modern to now is terrorism, or the development and changes within terrorism. There you go. That's how you might model that process. Now you'll be thinking, oh, that's really similar to the 10 marker and the 18 marker. But the way the marks are broken down in the 9 marker are very different to how they're broken down in the 10 marker. So if I just pop it on the board there you go. There you've got those 2 assessment objectives there. Now those 2 assessment objectives are available in every question on the crime and punishment paper. You have AO1, which is knowledge. You have AO2, which is your explanations. However, on the 9 marker, it's a bit unbalanced. There's an imbalance there. The explanation marks are only worth 3, and the knowledge marks are worth 6, which means this is a far more knowledge and detail heavy question. So, keeping that in mind, I'm just going to give you a moment to think about how you might plan a response to this question, what you might respond with. Maybe have a minute to make a mind map about the types of things you might answer with, and pause me for a second so you can do that yourself. Now here I've had a go myself. Now I've actually made multiple examples. I've got 4 different lines of argument. I haven't even used the one I used as a model earlier. I've got technology, substances, diversity, and social tolerance. And then I've built on that with specific detail. So substances, I've got cannabis, heroin, ecstasy, cocaine. All these are new drug substances which are introduced in the 20th century, meaning smuggling as a crime grows massively. Therefore, new laws, new legislation had to be introduced, and law enforcement itself had to change with the introduction of drug squads and drug units in the police. So, keeping that in mind, what would a good response look like? Here we go. Now, this might be structured a little bit different to what you might be used to, but it does actually hit off all 4 of those steps. And as long as you hit off those 4 steps in your paragraphs on the 9 marker, you're sure to succeed. Now, if I read through this, you'll see how the author has done that. Since 1900, crime in Britain has undergone significant change, particularly as a result of new technologies and substances. One key development was the invention and widespread use of cars. There's your line of argument. Which created entirely new crimes such as car theft, joyriding, and hit and run offences. Crimes that did not exist before the 20th century. Brilliant specific detail there, great fact, and you're going to be picking up those AO1s there. After that, the author says, by the mid-20th century, cars also enabled criminals to travel further and escape more easily. There's that explaining with a second order concept. Now, when you're thinking, what even is that second order concept, you might be getting, it might be a bit of a confusing term for you. But the way I describe it is, the first order is the fact that immediately jumps to your head. Like, if someone just says to you, analyse crime in Britain since 1900, you might think of cars. You might think of car theft, joyriding, and hit and run offences. But then the second order is the thinking you do around that fact. Why is that a crime? What were the risks? How is this a change? Who's affected by it? It's almost like that trickle-down thinking. And then there you say, by the mid-20th century, cars also enabled criminals to travel further and escape more easily. There's the second order concept. Well, criminals are benefiting from the invention of cars. Anyhow, let's get back to the structure. So after that explain with a second order concept, you'll see it then says changing the scale and organisation of crime. There's that link back to the question. If you don't link back to the question, you're not going to be as successful, because it says in the mark scheme, you've got to be consistent, you've got to be focused. And when it says that, that basically means it is telling you to constantly link back to the question and constantly stay along the same line of argument. After that, we've got another good example there. It says another major change was the increased use of drugs, especially from the 1960s onwards. Great line of argument, and then supported with specific detail. Substances such as cannabis, heroin, and later ecstasy became more common, leading to a rise in drug-related offences, including possession, dealing, and organised drug trafficking. Great specific detail, and in fairness, that last part there is actually a second order concept, the bit where it says leading to a rise in drug-related offences. This here is a second order concept. So the line between specific detail and a second order concept can often be blurred, because one specific detail can lead to another specific detail. But that leading word, that in itself is a second order concept. But then it goes on to say this prompted new legislation such as the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, which redefined what counted as criminal behaviour. Great second order concept there. These examples demonstrate clear change in both the types of crime committed and the way crime was defined and experienced in modern Britain. This here is a great example of what you might write in a 9 marker for a paragraph, and you just got to keep in mind with the 9 marker, hit the examiner with the detail over and over and over and over again. What facts do you know? How can you describe the context at the time? Because that AO1 there, that AO1 mark is trumping the AO2 mark. So just think about the facts you specifically know about that topic. This one in particular is really worthwhile planning for, having to think about what you actually know.